The morning sun cast long shadows across the pier at Naval Station Norfolk as families began gathering for the monthly community day aboard the USS Constellation. Helen Garrett adjusted her worn purse strap and glanced down at her daughter, Emma, who walked beside her with unusual quietness. The 12-year-old's sandy brown hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore her best jeans and a navy blue sweater that had seen better days. "You sure you want to do this today, sweetheart?" Helen asked, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had been asking that same question in different forms for months. "We could just go to the commissary and then head home." Emma's green eyes, so much like her father's, fixed on the massive gray hull of the aircraft carrier ahead of them. "I want to see the engine room, Mom. Dad always said the heart of any ship beats in the engine room." Helen's chest tightened at the mention of her late husband. Lieutenant Commander James Garrett had been gone for 2 years now, lost in a training accident that the Navy had classified with carefully worded reports about mechanical failure and pilot error. The settlement money had helped with immediate expenses, but it couldn't fill the void James had left in their small Norfolk apartment. "Honey, I know you miss him, but these tours are pretty basic. They probably won't even show the engine room to visitors," Helen said, trying to keep her tone gentle. "They will if I ask the right questions," Emma replied with the quiet confidence that sometimes startled her mother. It was a trait she'd inherited from James, along with his mechanical aptitude and his habit of studying technical manuals like bedtime stories. They joined the growing crowd of military families near the ship's gangway. Children ran between their parents' legs while teenagers tried to look bored despite their obvious excitement. Helen noticed the way some of the other military spouses nodded politely but kept their distance. The USS Constellation, despite its imposing presence, was facing a persistent and embarrassing problem. Its propulsion system had been stubbornly malfunctioning for weeks, baffling the Navy's most skilled engineers. It was against this backdrop of frustrated specialists and an unyielding mechanical mystery that Admiral Thomas King, a seasoned officer, found himself during a routine family day. When 12-year-old Emma Garrett quietly approached the carrier's massive engine room, Admiral King couldn't resist making a public spectacle of the situation. Laughing dismissively at the small girl's claim that she could help diagnose the elusive issue, he publicly wagered his reputation that no child could accomplish what his trained specialists couldn't. But then, Emma rolled up her sleeve, revealing her late father's Naval Academy class ring. As she began speaking in technical terms that left veteran sailors speechless, the Admiral's confident smirk vanished as quickly as his assumptions about military families and the unexpected wisdom that lives within them. Helen noticed the polite nods from other military spouses who nonetheless kept their distance. Since James's death, she'd felt increasingly isolated from the close-knit community that had once been their anchor. As they approached the gangway, Captain Jennifer Ross stood at the top, her crisp white uniform gleaming under the morning sun. At 45, her authority stemmed from competence rather than strictness, and her warm smile immediately put the visiting families at ease. Beside her, Commander Alan Price, impeccably uniformed and rigid in posture, clearly viewed protocol with utmost seriousness. His narrow face betrayed barely concealed impatience as he repeatedly checked his watch. "Welcome aboard the USS Constellation," Captain Ross announced as the first group reached the deck. "We're honored to have you visit our floating city today. I'm Captain Ross, and this is Commander Price, my executive officer. We'll be giving you a tour that will show you how 7,000 sailors work together to project American power across the world's oceans." Emma listened intently, but her true focus was on the subtle vibrations beneath her feet. The ship's systems hummed with a rhythm that felt subtly off, like a finely tuned engine that had developed a slight, persistent cough. She'd spent countless hours absorbing her father's explanations of the intricate machinery that powered modern warships. The tour commenced on the flight deck, where a petty officer demonstrated how aircraft were secured and launched. Emma observed politely, yet her mind continually drifted to the complex mechanical heart of the vessel below. When the group proceeded to the bridge, she lingered by a maintenance hatch, meticulously studying its seals and labels. Chief Petty Officer Ray Palmer, a man of 52 with a weathered face, noticed the young girl's intense concentration. He'd encountered enough Navy families over the years to instinctively recognize the children who truly grasped the essence of their parents' work. Something in Emma's keen observations reminded him of those bright young dependents who often grew up to serve themselves. "You interested in how this old ship works?" Ray asked, his face crinkling into a warm smile. Emma looked up at him, her green eyes serious. "My dad was an engineer. He taught me that every system has a signature, a unique way it sounds and feels when it's running right." "Smart man," Ray acknowledged, genuinely impressed by her vocabulary and understanding. "What kind of engineer was he?" "Naval systems integration," Emma replied without hesitation. "He specialized in propulsion efficiency and power distribution. He said the Nimitz-class carriers were engineering marvels, but they required constant attention to maintain optimal performance." Ray's eyebrows rose slightly. Most 12-year-olds couldn't even pronounce propulsion efficiency, let alone articulate its meaning. "That's some pretty advanced stuff," he mused. "Your dad teach you about engines?" "Some," Emma confirmed softly, then added almost in a whisper, "before he died." Their conversation was abruptly interrupted by Commander Price's voice, sharp and echoing across the deck. "Families, please stay with your designated guide. This is a working warship, not a playground." Ray noticed the commander's harsh tone and the way several children instinctively moved closer to their parents. "Don't mind him," Ray whispered to Emma. "Commander Price thinks everything needs to run like a Swiss watch." As the tour continued below decks, Emma found herself walking near the back of the group. The corridors were narrow, lined with pipes and electrical conduits that carried the ship's lifeblood. She could hear the distant thrum of machinery, but something about the sound pattern troubled her. They paused outside the engine room, where thick blast doors were marked with warning signs about authorized personnel only. Through a small observation window, Emma could see the massive turbines that powered the ship's 4 propeller shafts. The tour guide, a young seaman, began explaining basic facts about the ship's power plant. "The Constellation is powered by 2 nuclear reactors that can generate enough electricity to power a city of 100,000 people," the seaman recited. "The steam from these reactors drives turbines that can push this ship at speeds exceeding 30 knots. Emma pressed closer to the window, her trained ear picking up subtle irregularities in the engine's rhythm. She'd spent hundreds of hours in her father's workshop, learning to diagnose problems by sound alone. What she was hearing now suggested a synchronization issue between the primary and secondary power systems. "Excuse me," Emma said, raising her hand like she was in school. "Is there a problem with the port turbine's harmonic frequency?" The young seaman blinked in confusion. I'm sorry. What? The vibration pattern sounds like there might be a phase mismatch in the power coupling, Emma continued, her voice growing more confident despite the attention she was drawing. My dad always said that kind of irregularity could indicate bearing wear or fluid flow restriction. The tour group had stopped moving, and several adults were staring at the small girl who was discussing advanced engineering concepts with the ease of someone reading a grocery list. Helen felt her cheeks burning as she realized Emma was becoming the center of attention. Emma, honey, let's not bother the nice sailor, Helen said, reaching for her daughter's hand. But Commander Price had overheard the exchange, and his expression had shifted from annoyance to disbelief. Young lady, did you just suggest there's something wrong with our propulsion system? Emma met his gaze steadily. I didn't suggest anything, sir. I just asked if there was a problem because the acoustic signature indicates a potential efficiency issue. The acoustic signature? Commander Price repeated, his voice dripping with skepticism. And you learned about acoustic signatures from your father? Yes, sir. He said that every mechanical system tells you what's wrong if you know how to listen. Captain Ross had joined the group, drawn by the unusual conversation. She studied Emma with professional interest, noting the girl's calm demeanor and precise language. What did your father do in the Navy? Garrett, ma'am. He was a systems engineer specializing in propulsion efficiency. The name clearly resonated with Captain Ross, whose expression softened with recognition. Jim Garrett. I knew your father. He was one of the finest engineers I ever worked with. Emma's face lit up with pride, but Commander Price remained skeptical. Captain, with all due respect, this is a family tour, not a technical consultation. Perhaps we should continue with the scheduled program. Actually, Captain Ross said thoughtfully, we have been experiencing some minor efficiency issues with the port turbine. Nothing critical, but our engineers haven't been able to isolate the cause. Emma's excitement was barely contained. Could I see the diagnostic readouts? Dad taught me how to interpret performance data and identify pattern anomalies. Emma, Helen said sharply, mortified by her daughter's boldness. You can't just ask to look at Navy technical information. But Admiral Thomas King had arrived on the scene, drawn by reports of an unusual situation during the family tour. At 58, King was a career officer who'd risen through the ranks by maintaining strict discipline and unwavering confidence in military hierarchy. His silver hair was perfectly groomed, and his uniform bore the ribbons of 3 decades of distinguished service. What seems to be the problem here? Admiral King asked, his authoritative voice cutting through the murmur of conversation. Commander Price straightened to attention. Sir, we have a civilian dependent claiming she can diagnose problems with our propulsion system. Admiral King's gaze fell on Emma, and his expression mixed amusement with disbelief. You're telling me a child thinks she can solve engineering problems that have stumped our trained specialists? Emma felt the weight of his skepticism, but she also remembered her father's advice about standing up for what you believed was right. I don't think I can solve anything, Admiral. I just noticed something that might be worth checking. You noticed something? Admiral King repeated, his tone making it clear what he thought of a 12-year-old's observations. And what exactly did you notice? The harmonic frequency of the port turbine suggests a phase mismatch that could indicate bearing degradation or flow restriction in the steam feed lines, Emma said, her voice steady despite the growing crowd of onlookers. Admiral King's laugh was not entirely kind. Harmonic frequency? Phase mismatch? Those are impressive words for someone your age. Emma felt her cheeks reddening, but she pressed on. My dad always said that understanding comes from listening, not from rank or age. Your father said that, did he? Admiral King's smile was patronizing. Well, young lady, I've been listening to ship engines for longer than you've been alive, and I can assure you that our engineering team is more than capable of handling any issues that might arise. The crowd had grown larger, with sailors and family members drawn by the unusual confrontation. Emma could feel their eyes on her, and she began to doubt herself. Maybe she was wrong. Maybe she was just embarrassing her mother and making a fool of herself. But then she remembered sitting in her father's workshop, listening to him explain how engines talk to those who knew their language. She recalled the pride in his voice when she correctly identified a problem with their neighbor's car just by listening to it idle. Most importantly, she remembered his words about courage and conviction. Emma pulled back the sleeve of her sweater, revealing a gold Naval Academy class ring that was far too large for her small wrist. It hung from a simple chain, resting against her forearm like a talisman. The ring bore the class, year, 2001, and the initials, JG. This was my father's ring, Emma said quietly. He gave it to me before his last deployment and told me that it represented honor, courage, and commitment. He said those weren't just words, but promises we make to each other and to our country. The effect on the crowd was immediate and profound. Admiral King's confident expression faltered as he recognized the significance of what he was seeing. A Naval Academy graduate's ring was not given lightly, and the fact that this child wore it spoke to a loss that went beyond a simple family tragedy. Captain Ross stepped forward, her voice gentle but firm. Admiral, perhaps we should listen to what Emma has to say. Admiral King stared at the ring for a long moment, his military bearing wavering as memories surfaced. He'd known James Garrett, had even recommended him for advanced training just months before the fatal accident. The weight of that loss suddenly felt personal in a way that protocol manuals never addressed. Lieutenant Michelle Lewis, Captain Ross called to a young officer standing nearby. Please escort our guests to the engineering observation deck. I think we need to take Miss Garrett's concerns seriously. Lieutenant Lewis, barely 29 and still proving herself in the male-dominated engineering corps, approached with curious professionalism. Her auburn hair was pulled back in regulation style, and her green eyes showed the intelligence that had earned her a spot on the Constellation's technical team. Ma'am, the observation deck isn't typically part of civilian tours, Lieutenant Lewis said, carefully, glancing between Captain Ross and Admiral King. Today it is, Captain Ross replied firmly. Miss Garrett has identified a potential issue that our engineering team should evaluate. Admiral King's jaw tightened as he watched the situation slip beyond his control. In 30 years of service, he'd never had his authority challenged by a child, and the public nature of the confrontation made retreat impossible. Very well, Captain, but when this proves to be nothing more than a child's imagination, I trust we can return to proper procedures. The group moved through the ship's corridors, with Emma walking between her increasingly nervous mother and the confident Lieutenant Lewis. The young officer found herself genuinely curious about the girl's technical claims, having struggled against similar dismissive attitudes throughout her own career. "Tell me about these acoustic signatures your father taught to. Lieutenant Lewis said as they descended toward the engineering spaces. "What specifically are you hearing?" Emma's face brightened at the serious question. "It's like when our old car was having transmission problems. Dad showed me how healthy engines have this steady rhythm, but when something's wearing out or misaligned, you get these little hiccups in the pattern. And you're hearing hiccups in our turbine?" "Not exactly hiccups," Emma said, searching for the right words. "More like when two musicians are playing the same song, but one's slightly off-tempo. Dad called it phase displacement." Lieutenant Lewis nodded thoughtfully. Phase displacement was indeed a legitimate engineering concern, especially in complex systems where multiple components had to work in perfect harmony. The fact that a 12-year-old could articulate the concept suggested more than casual knowledge. They reached the engineering observation deck, a glass-encased area that allowed visitors to view the massive turbine hull without entering restricted spaces. The space hummed with activity as sailors monitored gauges and made minor adjustments to the ship's power systems. Through the thick windows, Emma could see the enormous turbines that drove the ship's propellers. Chief Petty Officer Ray Palmer was waiting for them, having been summoned by Captain Ross. His weathered hands held a clipboard with performance data, and his expression showed the mixture of skepticism and curiosity that came from 28 years of naval service. "Chief Palmer," Captain Ross said, "Miss Garrett believes she's identified an issue with our port turbine. I'd like you to show her the current performance readings." Ray glanced at Admiral King, whose stony expression made his feelings clear, then back at Emma. "Well, miss, we've been tracking some minor efficiency variations, but nothing outside acceptable parameters." Emma moved to the observation window and pressed her ear against the glass, closing her eyes to concentrate on the sound patterns below. The technique looked odd, but it was exactly what her father had taught her for isolating specific acoustic signatures from background noise. After nearly a minute of intense listening, Emma opened her eyes and turned back to the group. "The port turbine is running about 4% off synchronization with the starboard unit. It's not enough to trigger your automatic warnings, but it's creating harmonic stress that'll cause bearing failure within 6 to 8 weeks. The specificity of her prediction sent a ripple of unease through the assembled naval personnel. Ray Palmer looked down at his clipboard, then back at Emma with growing respect. "How could you possibly know our synchronization tolerances?" Dad had all the technical specifications for Nimitz-class propulsion systems, Emma explained. He said that understanding the acceptable ranges was just as important as knowing when something was broken. Admiral King stepped forward, his patience clearly wearing thin. "This is absurd. We have sophisticated monitoring equipment that would detect any significant problems long before they became critical." "With respect, Admiral," Emma said quietly, "sometimes the best equipment is right here." She tapped her ear gently. Dad always said that experienced engineers could hear problems that computers missed, because machines measure what they're programmed to measure, but they don't really listen. Lieutenant Lewis found herself caught between protocol and genuine technical curiosity. "Chief Palmer, what are our current efficiency readings showing?" Ray consulted his clipboard again, his expression growing more thoughtful. Port turbine is running at 96.2% efficiency, starboard at 99.8. We attributed the difference to normal operational variation. That's exactly the kind of variation that indicates early-stage bearing wear, Emma said with growing confidence. The port turbine is working harder to maintain the same output because internal friction is increasing. Commander Alan Price, who had been silent during the technical discussion, finally spoke up. This is preposterous. We're allowing a child to second-guess our entire engineering department based on what she thinks she hears. Actually, a new voice interjected, the child might be onto something. Everyone turned to see Petty Officer First Class Mark Bennett approaching from the turbine hall below. At 35, Mark had spent 15 years working on naval propulsion systems, and his hands bore the permanent stains of someone who solved problems with tools rather than theories. "Mark, what are you doing up here?" Chief Palmer asked. "Heard there was some discussion about the port turbine," Mark replied, wiping his hands on a shop rag. "Figured I should mention that we've been chasing a vibration issue down there for about 3 weeks. Nothing major, but it's been bothering me." Admiral King's confident expression began to show cracks. "Why wasn't this reported through proper channels?" "Because it's within tolerance, Admiral," Mark explained. "But if I'm being honest, something doesn't feel right. I've been meaning to pull the bearing inspection covers, but we've been too busy with routine maintenance." Emma looked up at her mother, seeking permission for what she was about to suggest. Helen Garrett's face was pale with anxiety, but she nodded slightly, recognizing the determined expression that had belonged to her late husband. "What if I could show you exactly where the problem is?" Emma asked. "Dad taught me how to use acoustic analysis to pinpoint bearing problems without having to disassemble anything." "Absolutely. Absolutely not," Commander Price said immediately. "Civilians are not authorized in engineering spaces, especially not children." "She wouldn't need to enter the restricted area," Lieutenant Lewis said thoughtfully. "If she's right about acoustic signatures, she could work from the observation deck while we relay information from below." Admiral King found himself in an impossible position. Dismissing the girl's claims outright risked looking foolish if she proved correct, but allowing her to participate in technical diagnostics set a precedent that violated every regulation he'd sworn to uphold. "This is highly irregular," Admiral King said finally. "However, if Miss Garrett is willing to demonstrate her claimed expertise under controlled conditions, I suppose we could allow a brief evaluation." Emma felt a surge of nervous excitement. "I'll need someone below to take readings at specific locations while I listen from up here, and if possible, I'd like to see the maintenance logs for the port turbine over the past 6 months." Chief Palmer and Mark Bennett exchanged glances. The girl's request was exactly what any competent engineer would ask for when investigating a potential problem. "I can get you the logs," Ray said. "Mark, you willing to take some readings down below?" "Sure thing, Chief. Might finally get to the bottom of this vibration issue." As the impromptu diagnostic session began to take shape, Helen Garrett pulled her daughter aside. "Emma, sweetheart, are you sure about this? If you're wrong, it's going to be very embarrassing." Emma looked at her mother with the serious expression she'd inherited from her father. "Mom, I've been listening to Dad's engine recordings every night since he died. I know I'm just a kid, but I also know what I'm hearing." The admission that Emma had been studying her father's technical recordings as a way of staying connected to him hit Helen like a physical blow. She thought her daughter was simply playing games on the old laptop, not conducting serious technical study as a form of grief processing. "Oh, honey," Helen whispered, pulling Emma into a quick hug. "Your father would be so proud of you." Meanwhile, Admiral King was having a quiet but intense conversation with Captain Ross. "Jennifer, this is completely unprecedented. If we're wrong about this, it reflects poorly on the entire command structure." "And if she's right, Admiral," Captain Ross replied, "how does it look if we dismissed legitimate technical concerns because they came from a 12-year-old? "The regulations exist for good reasons," Admiral King insisted. "Operational security, safety protocols, chain of command. We can't simply ignore them because a child has some theoretical knowledge." Captain Ross studied the Admiral's face, recognizing the conflict between his rigid adherence to protocol and his growing suspicion that Emma might actually know what she was talking about. "Thomas, you knew her father. Jim Garrett was one of the most gifted engineers I ever served with. Is it really so impossible that he passed some of that knowledge to his daughter?" Admiral King watched Emma, conferring quietly with Lieutenant Lewis about diagnostic procedures, noting the girl's professional demeanor and technical vocabulary. Despite his reservations, he couldn't deny that her knowledge seemed genuine. "5 minutes," Admiral King said finally. "She gets 5 minutes to prove her claims, and then we return to normal operations." Emma overheard the time limit and felt her stomach tighten with nervousness. 5 minutes wasn't much time to conduct a proper acoustic analysis, but it would have to be enough. She moved back to the observation window and prepared to put her father's teachings to the ultimate test. Below in the turbine hall, Mark Bennett positioned himself near the port turbine with a handheld vibration meter. "Ready up there?" he called through the intercom. Emma pressed her ear to the glass again, blocking out all distractions as she focused on the mechanical symphony below. In her mind, she could hear her father's voice explaining how each component contributed to the overall acoustic signature, and how subtle changes could reveal problems that hadn't yet become failures. "Tell me what you're hearing," Lieutenant Lewis said softly, genuinely curious about the girl's process. Emma's eyes remained closed as she spoke. "The main turbine shaft is running clean, but there's a secondary harmonic that's about 15 cycles off the primary frequency. That usually means one of the support bearings is developing uneven wear patterns." She paused, adjusting her position to get a better acoustic angle. "Mark, can you take a reading on the number 3 bearing housing? It should be about shoulder height on the port side of the turbine casing." Through the intercom, they could hear Mark moving into position. "Got it? Reading shows 0.07 millimeters of additional vibration compared to the baseline spec." Emma opened her eyes, her face showing the quiet satisfaction of a diagnosis confirmed. "That's your problem. The bearing is developing metal fatigue, probably caused by inadequate lubrication flow. If you check the oil pressure to that specific bearing, I bet you'll find it's running about 10% below optimal." Lieutenant Lewis looked at Chief Palmer with raised eyebrows. 0.07 millimeters was exactly the kind of minor variation that fell within acceptable ranges, but could indicate the early stages of component failure. Admiral King's expression had shifted from skepticism to grudging attention. "Mark, check the oil pressure to bearing number 3. The wait seemed eternal as Mark consulted gauges and made calculations below. Finally, his voice crackled through the intercom. Oil pressure to bearing 3 is running at 41 psi. Spec calls for 45 to 50 psi. Emma turned to face Admiral King, her green eyes steady and confident. 4 psi doesn't sound like much, but over time it creates exactly the kind of bearing wear that causes the acoustic signature I'm hearing. If you don't address it soon, you'll be looking at a major repair instead of a simple maintenance adjustment. The observation deck fell silent as the implications of Emma's diagnosis sank in. She had not only identified a legitimate problem, but had done so with a precision that impressed even the most experienced engineers present. Admiral King studied Emma with the calculating gaze of someone reassessing a fundamental assumption. The silence stretched uncomfortably until he spoke with deliberate control. "Miss Garrett, your diagnostic appears to be accurate. However, identifying a problem and solving it are entirely different matters." Emma sensed the challenge in his voice and the weight of expectation from everyone watching. "What do you mean, sir?" "I mean," Admiral King said, stepping closer to the observation window, "that any competent technician can point out what's wrong. The real test of engineering knowledge is understanding how to fix it." Commander Price seized the opening. "Admiral, surely we don't need to continue this demonstration. The girl has made her point, and our engineering team can handle the repairs, according to standard procedures." "Actually," Captain Ross interjected, "I'm curious to hear Miss Garrett's recommendations. Her father's approach to problem-solving was always innovative." Emma felt the pressure of competing expectations. But her father's voice echoed in her memory, reminding her that confidence came from knowledge, not from pleasing authority figures. The oil pressure problem could have several causes, but given the age of the system and the maintenance records Chief Palmer showed me, I'd guess the issue is a partially blocked oil distribution manifold. Lieutenant Lewis pulled out a tablet and began taking notes. "What makes you think it's the manifold rather than a pump issue?" "Because the other bearings are getting proper oil pressure," Emma explained, warming to the technical discussion. "If it was a pump problem, you'd see pressure drops across multiple points. But since it's isolated to bearing number 3, the blockage has to be downstream of the main distribution point." Mark Bennett's voice came through the intercom from below. "Kid's got a point. We replaced the main oil pump 8 months ago, but the manifold's original equipment from the ship's commissioning. 23 years of accumulated deposits," Emma added. "Dad always said that oil systems were like arteries. They needed regular cleaning to prevent blockages that could cause system failures." Admiral King's military bearing remained rigid, but Emma noticed a slight softening around his eyes. "And how would you recommend addressing this blockage, Miss Garrett?" Emma took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would determine whether she was taken seriously or dismissed as a curious child. "You'd need to isolate bearing number 3 from the oil distribution system, flush the manifold lines with solvent to remove deposits, and then run a pressure test to verify proper flow before bringing the bearing back online. That's a 12-hour maintenance procedure," Chief Palmer said, with obvious surprise. "How could you possibly know the time requirements?" "Dad made me memorize maintenance schedules for major systems," Emma said quietly. "He said that understanding the time and resource requirements was just as important as knowing the technical procedures." The admission that James Garrett had trained his young daughter in such detailed engineering knowledge sent a ripple of amazement through the group. It suggested a level of technical education that went far beyond casual father-daughter conversations. Helen Garrett watched her daughter with growing astonishment. She'd known Emma was bright and had absorbed some of James's technical knowledge. But the depth of her understanding was becoming clear for the first time. "Emma, when did your father teach you all this?" Helen asked. "Every weekend for 3 years," Emma replied, her voice carrying a note of wistfulness. "He said that engineering wasn't just his job. It was a way of understanding how the world worked. He wanted me to see problems the way he did." Dr. Barbara Wright, who had been quietly observing from the edge of the group, stepped forward. As the ship's senior psychologist, she'd seen how military children processed the unique stresses of their lifestyle. "Emma, that's quite a gift your father gave you. Not just the technical knowledge, but the confidence to trust your own observations." Emma smiled gratefully at the older woman, feeling understood in a way that had been rare since her father's death. "Dad always said that being right didn't matter if you were too scared to speak up." Admiral King found himself thinking about his own daughter, who was studying literature at a civilian university and had never shown the slightest interest in his military career. The idea that a father could pass such specialized knowledge to a child challenged his assumptions about family relationships and professional boundaries. "Miss Garrett," Admiral King said slowly, "assuming your diagnosis is correct, and assuming our engineering team implements your recommended repair procedures, how confident are you that this will resolve the efficiency problems we've been experiencing?" Emma considered the question seriously, understanding that her answer would be judged not just on technical accuracy, but on professional humility. "I'm confident the oil pressure issue is causing the bearing problems I identified, but Dad taught me that complex systems can have multiple problems and fixing one issue sometimes reveals others." Meaning that correcting the oil flow should improve the bearing performance and reduce the harmonic irregularities, I heard. But you should probably run a full diagnostic sequence after the repair to make sure there aren't other issues that were masked by this problem. Lieutenant Lewis looked up from her tablet, clearly impressed by Emma's methodical approach. "That's exactly what we do after any major maintenance procedure. You really have been well trained." The praise meant more to Emma than any adult recognition she'd received since her father's death. For months, she'd felt like her technical knowledge was just a painful reminder of loss. Now, for the first time, it felt like a meaningful connection to her father's legacy. Commander Price, however, remained unconvinced about the entire situation. "Admiral, while Miss Garrett's technical knowledge is impressive for her age, we still have protocols to follow. Maintenance decisions should be made by qualified personnel through proper channels." "You're absolutely right, Commander," Admiral King replied. "Which is why Chief Palmer will coordinate with our engineering department to implement the recommended repairs. Miss Garrett's role ends with her diagnostic contribution." Emma felt a flicker of disappointment, but understood the realities of military procedure. "That makes sense, sir. I hope the repair goes smoothly." "Actually," Captain Ross said thoughtfully, "there might be one more way Miss Garrett could contribute to this process." Admiral King's eyebrows rose questioningly. "Captain, our engineering training program for junior officers could benefit from someone who understands diagnostic techniques from a different perspective. Miss Garrett's approach to acoustic analysis might provide valuable insights for our newer personnel." Emma's eyes widened with excitement. "You mean I could teach other people what Dad taught me?" "In a limited supervised capacity," Captain Ross clarified. "Perhaps a brief presentation to our junior engineering staff about acoustic diagnostic techniques. It could be part of our continuing education program." Admiral King was quiet for a long moment, weighing the precedent such an arrangement would set against the potential value of Emma's unique knowledge. "That would be highly unusual, Captain." "Yes, sir, it would be. But so is having a 12-year-old correctly diagnose a propulsion problem that our regular monitoring systems missed." Lieutenant Lewis found herself caught up in the possibility. "Admiral, we've been looking for ways to enhance our diagnostic training. Traditional methods focus heavily on instrument readings, but acoustic analysis is a lost art in modern engineering. Dad always said that the old-timers could diagnose problems just by listening, but that younger engineers relied too much on computers," Emma added. "He thought both approaches were important." The mention of traditional versus modern engineering philosophies touched on a debate that Admiral King had wrestled with throughout his career. The Navy's increasing reliance on automated systems had undoubtedly improved safety and efficiency. But it had also created a generation of officers who sometimes lacked the intuitive understanding that came from hands-on experience. "Miss Garrett," Admiral King said finally, "if we were to arrange such a presentation, would you be prepared to explain not just what you observed, but how you learned to make such observations?" Emma nodded eagerly. "Dad always said that teaching something was the best way to make sure you really understood it yourself." Helen Garrett felt a surge of maternal pride mixed with concern. Her daughter was clearly thriving in this technical environment, but the attention and responsibility seemed overwhelming for someone who still needed help reaching items on high shelves. "Admiral," Helen said quietly, "I appreciate the opportunity you're considering for Emma, but she's still a child. I want to make sure this doesn't become too much pressure for her." Dr. Wright nodded approvingly at Helen's concern. "Mrs. Garrett raises an excellent point. Any educational involvement would need to be age-appropriate and voluntary with clear boundaries about Emma's role and responsibilities." "Of course," Admiral King replied. "This would be a one-time educational opportunity, not an ongoing assignment. Miss Garrett would simply share her knowledge with our junior officers and then return to her normal activities." Emma looked between her mother and the Admiral, understanding that this moment represented something larger than just a chance to talk about engines. It was an opportunity to honor her father's memory while potentially helping other people learn valuable skills. "Mom, I'd really like to do this," Emma said earnestly. "It would make me feel like Dad's teaching is still helping people even though he's gone." Helen saw the hope and determination in her daughter's eyes and recognized the same passion that had driven James throughout his career. Despite her concerns about the unusual situation, she understood that this opportunity might be exactly what Emma needed to process her grief in a constructive way. "If the Admiral thinks it would be appropriate," Helen said carefully, "and if Emma wants to do it, then I suppose we could try." Admiral King found himself approving a plan that violated every regulation about civilian involvement in military training. But as he watched Emma's face light up with excitement, he realized that sometimes leadership meant recognizing exceptional circumstances and responding with flexibility rather than rigid adherence to rules. "Very well," Admiral King said formally. "Chief Palmer, please coordinate with Lieutenant Lewis to schedule a brief presentation for our junior engineering personnel. Miss Garrett will demonstrate acoustic diagnostic techniques as part of our professional development program." The impromptu technical consultation had evolved into something none of them had anticipated, setting in motion events that would challenge traditional assumptions about expertise, authority, and the value of unconventional knowledge. 3 days later, Emma stood outside Conference Room B in the ship's administrative section, clutching a folder containing her father's handwritten notes on acoustic diagnostics. She'd spent the previous evening organizing the material with her mother's help, trying to translate complex engineering concepts into presentations that naval officers could understand and apply. Lieutenant Lewis appeared beside her, carrying a laptop and wearing the slightly nervous expression of someone responsible for an unprecedented event. "Ready for this, Emma?" "I think so," Emma replied, though her stomach felt like it was full of butterflies. "Mom helped me practice last night, but she's not an engineer, so I'm not sure if my explanations make sense." "They'll make sense," Lieutenant Lewis assured her. "I reviewed your outline yesterday, and your approach is more systematic than some of the training materials we use for new officers." Through the conference room's small window, Emma could see a dozen junior officers arranging chairs and setting up equipment. Most appeared to be in their 20s and early 30s, young enough to remember being underestimated themselves, but experienced enough to question whether a child could teach them anything useful. Captain Ross emerged from her office down the hallway, walking with the purposeful stride that had earned her respect throughout the fleet. "Miss Garrett, thank you for agreeing to share your knowledge with our team. This kind of cross-generational learning is exactly what the Navy needs," replied. "This would be a one-time educational opportunity, not an ongoing assignment. Miss Garrett would simply share her knowledge with our junior officers and then return to her normal activities." Emma looked between her mother and the Admiral, understanding that this moment represented something larger than just a chance to talk about engines. It was an opportunity to honor her father's memory while potentially helping other people learn valuable skills. "Mom, to stay innovative." Emma felt some of her nervousness fade in the face of Captain Ross's confidence. "My dad always said that knowledge was only valuable if you shared it with people who could use it." "Wise man. Are you prepared to answer questions about your methods?" "Yes, ma'am. Dad taught me that if you really understand something, you should be able to explain it in different ways until people get it." Captain Ross smiled at the echo of Lieutenant Commander Garrett's teaching philosophy. James had been known for his ability to make complex systems understandable to sailors at every level of technical expertise. They entered the conference room where the assembled officers rose to attention out of respect for Captain Ross. Emma noticed that their expressions ranged from curious to skeptical, with a few showing the barely concealed amusement of adults about to be lectured by a 12-year-old. "At ease, everyone," Captain Ross said, gesturing for the officers to sit. "Today's presentation is part of our ongoing professional development series. Miss Emma Garrett will be sharing acoustic diagnostic techniques that may enhance your troubleshooting capabilities." Ensign Kevin O'Brien, fresh from the Naval Academy and eager to prove his technical competence, leaned forward with obvious skepticism. "Captain, with all due respect, acoustic analysis requires years of experience and specialized training. How can someone so young have developed that level of expertise?" Emma felt her cheeks flush, but she remembered her father's advice about responding to challenges with facts rather than emotion. "Ensign O'Brien, You're absolutely right that acoustic analysis usually requires extensive experience. But my father started teaching me these techniques when I was 9 years old, so I've actually been learning for 3 years. 3 years? Ensign O'Brien repeated, his tone suggesting he found the time frame inadequate. Yes, sir. Dad said that children's hearing is actually more sensitive than adults in some frequency ranges, and that we don't have preconceived notions about what engines are supposed to sound like. Lieutenant Junior Grade, Sarah Hayes, who'd been struggling with a persistent hydraulic problem on her assigned aircraft, found herself genuinely interested. Miss Garrett, what exactly did your father teach you about frequency analysis? Emma opened her folder and pulled out a sheet covered with her father's precise handwriting and her own childish notes in the margins. He taught me that every mechanical system creates a unique acoustic fingerprint based on its design and condition. When components start to wear or fail, they change that fingerprint in predictable ways. She moved to the front of the room, her initial nervousness giving way to enthusiasm for her subject. For example, bearing wear creates harmonic distortions that occur at specific multiples of the shaft rotation frequency. If you know what to listen for, you can identify problems weeks before they show up on conventional monitoring equipment. Petty Officer Second Class. David Kim, who'd been maintaining aircraft engines for 8 years, looked up from his notes with surprise. That's exactly what the old chief taught me about helicopter transmissions. But I've never seen it applied to ship systems. The principles are the same, Emma explained, gaining confidence from the recognition in David's voice. Dad showed me how to identify the fundamental frequencies of different components and then listen for the harmonics that indicate developing problems. Lieutenant Lewis connected her laptop to the room's projection system. Emma has prepared some audio samples that demonstrate these concepts. Why don't you walk us through what you're hearing? Emma nodded and clicked on the first audio file. The room filled with the deep rhythmic sound of a large engine running smoothly. This is a healthy turbine operating at normal parameters. Notice how the primary frequency is steady and the harmonics are minimal. She clicked to the next file, and the assembled officers heard a subtly different sound pattern. To most of them, it sounded nearly identical to the first sample, but Emma's trained ear picked up the variations immediately. This turbine has early-stage bearing wear on the high-pressure stage. You can hear the slight frequency modulation every third rotation cycle, which indicates uneven loading on the bearing surfaces. Ensign O'Brien frowned as he tried to distinguish the differences Emma described. I'm not hearing the variations you're talking about. That's normal, Emma said without condescension. Dad said it took him 2 years of practice before he could consistently identify subtle problems, but once you know what to listen for, it becomes obvious. She played the audio sample again, this time narrating the specific moments when the frequency irregularities occurred. Gradually, several officers began to nod as they started to hear the patterns Emma was describing. Chief Warrant Officer Gary Mitchell, who'd been maintaining naval systems for 23 years, spoke up with grudging respect. Miss Garrett, what you're describing sounds like the old-school diagnostic techniques we used before we had computerized monitoring systems. Exactly, Emma replied eagerly. Dad said that computers are great for measuring things, but they can only detect problems that they're programmed to recognize. Human hearing can pick up anomalies that don't fit standard failure patterns. But surely modern diagnostic equipment is more accurate than human perception, Lieutenant J.G. Hayes argued. Emma considered the question seriously. Not more accurate exactly, but more precise. Computers can measure vibration amplitude to 6 decimal places, but they might miss a bearing that's failing in an unusual way because the failure doesn't match their programmed parameters. She clicked to another audio file. This is a bearing that was developing cracks in the inner race. The computer monitoring system showed all parameters within normal limits right up until catastrophic failure. But you can hear the acoustic signature of the developing crack if you know what to listen for. The room fell silent as the officers absorbed the implications of what Emma was saying. Modern naval systems relied heavily on automated monitoring, but the idea that critical failures could develop undetected was troubling. Chief Mitchell leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "We had a similar situation last year on the USS Hampton. Hydraulic pump showed green on all diagnostics until it seized completely during flight operations." "What kind of acoustic signature did it have before failure?" Emma asked with professional interest. "Come to think of it, there was an unusual whining sound for about a week before it failed. We reported it, but since the diagnostics showed normal operation, maintenance said it wasn't a priority." Emma nodded knowingly. High-frequency whining usually indicates fluid cavitation or internal scoring. Dad taught me that hydraulic systems are especially tricky because the problems often develop faster than mechanical systems. Lieutenant Lewis watched the interaction with fascination. Emma was discussing complex technical failures with experienced naval personnel as if she were a peer rather than a child. The depth of her knowledge was becoming impossible to dismiss. "Miss Garrett," Lieutenant Lewis said, "could you show us how to systematically analyze an unknown acoustic signature?" Emma's eyes lit up with excitement. "Dad taught me a step-by-step process for breaking down complex sounds into their component frequencies. Would you like me to demonstrate with a live system?" Captain Ross, who'd been observing quietly from the back of the room, stepped forward. "What did you have in mind?" "Well, I noticed when we came aboard today that one of the aircraft elevators was making an interesting sound. If I could listen to it while it operates, I might be able to demonstrate real-time acoustic analysis." The suggestion caused a stir among the assembled officers. Aircraft elevators were critical flight deck systems, and any problems with them could affect combat operations. Ensign O'Brien looked skeptical. "Miss Garrett, those elevators are inspected daily by qualified technicians. I'm sure any problems would have been identified through proper maintenance procedures." "Probably," Emma agreed. But Dad always said there was a difference between something being broken and something not working optimally. Even if the elevator meets all safety requirements, there might be efficiency issues that could be addressed. Chief Mitchell stood up, his curiosity overcoming his initial skepticism. "Captain, if Miss Garrett is willing to demonstrate her techniques on a live system, it might be educational for all of us." Captain Ross considered the request. Aircraft elevators were indeed critical systems, but they were also heavily monitored and maintained. If Emma could identify potential issues before they became problems, it would validate her diagnostic approach in a way that audio recordings couldn't. "Very well," Captain Ross decided. "We'll move this session to the flight deck so Miss Garrett can demonstrate live acoustic analysis. But I want to be clear that this is purely educational. Any maintenance decisions will be made through normal channels after proper evaluation." Emma felt a thrill of excitement mixed with nervousness. Demonstrating her skills on recorded audio was one thing, but performing live analysis in front of experienced naval officers would test everything her father had taught her. As the group prepared to move to the flight deck, Lieutenant Lewis noticed that Emma's hands were shaking slightly. "Hey, you okay?" Emma looked up at the young officer who'd become her advocate. "I think so. It's just that this is the first time I've tried to teach Dad's techniques to other people. I want to make sure I do it right." "You're doing great," Lieutenant Lewis assured her. "Your father would be proud of how you're sharing his knowledge." The comment brought tears to Emma's eyes, but also strengthened her resolve. This wasn't just about proving her own abilities. It was about honoring her father's legacy and ensuring that his innovative approach to engineering wouldn't die with him. The flight deck of the USS Constellation stretched like a small city beneath the afternoon sun, with aircraft secured in precise rows and deck crews moving with practiced efficiency. Emma felt the salt breeze whip through her hair as she followed Captain Ross and the group of officers toward the massive aircraft elevator that connected the hangar deck to the flight operations area. Aviation boatswain's Mate First Class Rodriguez, who oversaw the elevator operations, approached them. Chief Paul Stevens was waiting for them, his weathered face showing the skepticism of someone who'd spent 20 years maintaining flight deck systems. At 42, Paul had seen every kind of equipment failure imaginable and trusted his own experience more than theoretical knowledge. "Captain, heard you wanted to run some kind of test on elevator number 2, Paul said, his tone respectful but wary. "System passed all safety checks this morning, and we've got flight operations scheduled in 4 hours. "Chief Stevens, this is Miss Emma Garrett," Captain Ross said. "She's going to demonstrate acoustic diagnostic techniques that might help us identify potential maintenance issues before they become problems." Paul looked down at Emma with barely concealed disbelief. "Ma'am, with respect, that elevator moves 30,000-pound aircraft. It's not exactly a teaching tool." Emma understood his concern and felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. "Chief Stevens, I'm not asking to operate anything or change any procedures. I just want to listen while you run your normal operational checks." "Listen to what exactly?" Emma walked closer to the elevator platform, noting the massive hydraulic rams and cable systems that powered the mechanism. "Every elevator has a specific acoustic signature when it's operating properly. Changes in that signature can indicate developing problems with hydraulics, bearings, or structural components." She knelt beside one of the hydraulic assemblies, pressing her ear close to the housing without actually touching the equipment. "Dad taught me that hydraulic systems are especially revealing because fluid dynamics create very specific sound patterns when everything's working correctly." Ensign O'Brien, who'd been growing more skeptical throughout the day, stepped forward. "Miss Garrett, these systems are monitored by sophisticated pressure sensors and flow meters. If there were problems, we'd know about them." "Maybe," Emma said calmly. "But Dad always said that sensors tell you what's happening right now, while acoustic analysis can sometimes predict what's going to happen next." Chief Mitchell, who'd been quietly observing Emma's methodical approach, found himself remembering his early training under grizzled chiefs who could diagnose problems by smell and sound alone. "Chief Stevens, it might be worth letting her listen. Won't hurt anything, and we might learn something." Paul looked between the assembled officers and the serious young girl who spoke about hydraulic systems like an experienced technician. Against his better judgment, he found himself curious about what she might observe. "All right," Paul said finally. "But this is a live system with safety protocols. Nobody touches anything. And if I say we stop immediately." Emma nodded enthusiastically. "Understood, Chief. Could you run the elevator through one complete cycle while I listen from different positions?" Paul moved to the control station and initiated the elevator's descent. Sequence. The massive platform began lowering smoothly toward the hangar deck, hydraulic pumps humming with the controlled power of sophisticated engineering. Emma positioned herself near the primary hydraulic manifold. Her eyes closed in concentration as she focused on the subtle variations in sound that most people would dismiss as normal operational noise. The assembled officers watched in fascination as she moved systematically around the elevator mechanism, pausing at specific locations to listen intently. "The primary pump sounds healthy," Emma announced without opening her eyes. "Good fluid flow, steady pressure, no cavitation in the main lines." Lieutenant J.G. Hayes was taking notes, genuinely interested in Emma's systematic approach. "What exactly are you listening for in the pump?" "A smooth, consistent frequency without harmonic irregularities," Emma explained, moving to the next hydraulic assembly. "When pumps start to wear, they develop characteristic whining or grinding sounds that indicate bearing problems or impeller damage." She paused near the secondary hydraulic circuit, her expression growing more focused. After nearly 30 seconds of intense listening, she opened her eyes with a slight frown. "Chief Stevens, what's the normal operating pressure for the secondary hydraulic circuit?" Paul consulted his control panel. "Secondary circuit runs at 2,800 psi during normal operations, currently showing 2,790. Emma's frown deepened. That 10 psi difference might not seem like much, but it's creating a slight pressure oscillation in the secondary manifold. You can hear it as a very faint pulsing sound every 3 to 4 seconds. "I don't hear any pulsing," Ensign O'Brien said dismissively. Emma moved closer to the secondary manifold housing and gestured for him to join her. "Put your ear right here and listen for about 30 seconds. The pulse is very subtle, but once you hear it, it becomes obvious." Ensign O'Brien reluctantly knelt beside Emma, pressing his ear to the position she indicated. For the first 20 seconds, he heard only the general hum of hydraulic operation. Then, gradually, he began to distinguish a faint rhythmic variation in the background noise. "I think I hear something," he admitted grudgingly, "like a very quiet heartbeat." "Exactly," Emma said with excitement. "That pulsing indicates a slight restriction in the fluid flow, probably caused by partial blockage in one of the filter assemblies." Chief Stevens was now paying close attention, his professional skepticism giving way to technical curiosity. "Miss Garrett, if you're right about a flow restriction, what kind of problems could that cause?" Emma considered the question carefully, drawing on her father's teachings about system interactions and failure modes. In the short term, probably nothing critical. The system would still meet safety requirements and operational specifications, but over time, the restriction would cause increased wear on pump components and could lead to pressure fluctuations that affect elevator timing. She paused, studying the control readouts visible from her position. More importantly, if the restriction gets worse, you could end up with pressure drops during heavy load operations. That might not be dangerous, but it could affect flight deck efficiency during combat operations. The implications of Emma's analysis rippled through the group of officers. Flight deck efficiency was crucial to naval aviation operations, and any factor that could affect aircraft launch and recovery cycles was taken seriously. Lieutenant Lewis was rapidly taking notes on her tablet. "Emma, how would you recommend addressing this potential restriction?" "Dad always said that hydraulic problems should be approached systematically," Emma replied. "I'd start by checking the secondary circuit's filter assemblies for accumulated debris, then test the flow rates at different pressure levels to isolate where the restriction is occurring." Chief Stevens found himself nodding along with Emma's recommendations, recognizing the logical progression that any experienced hydraulic technician would follow. "That's standard troubleshooting procedure for flow irregularities," Lieutenant Lewis observed. "The difference is that Emma identified the problem through acoustic analysis before it showed up on conventional diagnostics. If she's right, we could address it during routine maintenance instead of waiting for it to become a bigger issue." Captain Ross had been listening to the technical discussion with growing appreciation for Emma's methodical approach. "Chief Stevens, when is your next scheduled maintenance period for this elevator?" "We've got a 4-hour window next Tuesday during reduced flight operations," Paul replied. "Perfect time to check those filter assemblies if Miss Garrett's diagnosis is accurate." Emma felt a surge of pride at being taken seriously by experienced naval personnel, but she also remembered her father's warnings about overconfidence. "Chief Stevens, I could be wrong about the severity of the restriction. Dad always said that acoustic analysis was best used to guide conventional testing, not replace it." "Understood," Paul said, his respect for Emma clearly growing. "But even if you're only partially right, it's worth checking. We've learned to trust unusual observations from people who know what they're looking at." Ensign O'Brien, who'd been struggling with his initial skepticism, found himself reconsidering his assumptions about expertise and experience. "Miss Garrett, how do you distinguish between normal operational variations and actual problems?" Emma welcomed the genuine question, recognizing it as a sign that she was successfully communicating her father's teachings. "Dad taught me that every system has a baseline acoustic signature when it's operating correctly. Once you learn that baseline, any deviation becomes noticeable." She gestured toward the elevator mechanism. "This system's baseline includes the primary pump frequency, the fluid flow characteristics, and the mechanical sounds of the lifting apparatus. When you hear something that doesn't fit the baseline pattern, that's when you investigate further. But learning those baselines must take years of experience," Lieutenant J.G. Hayes observed. "It does," Emma agreed. "But Dad said that children have some advantages in acoustic learning, because we don't have preconceived notions about what things should sound like. We just learn the patterns without assuming anything." Dr. Barbara Wright, who'd been observing the demonstration with professional interest, stepped forward. "Emma, that's a fascinating point about learning without preconceptions. Your father was clearly an exceptional teacher as well as an engineer." Emma's eyes brightened with memories of weekend lessons in her father's workshop. "He said that teaching was just another form of engineering. You had to understand how someone's mind worked before you could help them solve problems." The comment resonated with several of the officers who'd struggled with traditional military training methods that emphasized memorization over understanding. Emma's approach to diagnostic techniques seemed to bridge the gap between theoretical knowledge and practical application. Chief Mitchell looked up from his own notes, clearly impressed by what he'd witnessed. "Captain, this kind of diagnostic training could be valuable for all our technical personnel. We spend a lot of time fixing problems after they break, but not enough time learning to prevent them." "I agree," Captain Ross replied, "Miss Garrett, would you be willing to work with Chief Stevens to document your acoustic analysis techniques, not as an ongoing assignment, but as a contribution to our training materials?" Emma looked toward her mother, who'd been watching from a respectful distance throughout the demonstration. Helen nodded encouragingly, understanding that this opportunity represented something important for her daughter's sense of purpose and connection to her father's legacy. "I'd be honored to help," Emma said seriously. "Dad always said that knowledge was only valuable if it helped other people do their jobs better." As the group prepared to return from the flight deck, Emma felt a deep sense of satisfaction that went beyond a personal achievement. For the first time since her father's death, she felt like his teachings were making a real difference in the world, and that his legacy would continue through the people she was teaching. Word of Emma's diagnostic successes spread through the ship with the speed that only naval communications could achieve. By evening, stories had reached the Pentagon through official channels and beyond, through the informal networks that connected military families across the globe. What had begun as a simple Family Day demonstration was evolving into something that challenged fundamental assumptions about expertise and institutional learning. Rear Admiral Kenneth Howard sat in his Pentagon office reviewing the official report that had crossed his desk an hour earlier. At 61, Kenneth had built his career on maintaining order and predictability within naval operations. The idea that a 12-year-old civilian had identified multiple technical issues that trained personnel had missed troubled him on several levels. His aide, Commander Patricia Wells, knocked and entered with additional documentation. "Sir, I have the technical reports you requested regarding the USS Constellation incidents." Kenneth accepted the files without looking up from his computer screen. "Commander, in your professional opinion, how should the Navy respond to this situation?" Patricia had anticipated the question and had spent considerable time researching precedents. "Sir, there are no direct precedents for civilian dependents providing technical consultation to naval operations. However, the diagnostic accuracy suggests legitimate expertise that shouldn't be dismissed simply due to age or civilian status." "But surely you understand the implications if we officially recognize a child's technical contributions," Kenneth said, finally looking up from his screen. "It undermines the authority structure that maintains discipline and operational effectiveness." "With respect, Admiral," Patricia replied carefully, "it might also demonstrate that the Navy values innovation and recognizes expertise wherever it originates." Kenneth's expression hardened slightly. He'd spent 3 decades climbing through naval hierarchy by following established procedures and respecting traditional authority structures. The suggestion that a 12-year-old could contribute meaningfully to complex technical operations felt like a direct challenge to everything he'd worked to achieve. Meanwhile, aboard the Constellation, Emma was experiencing the unexpected consequences of her newfound recognition. During dinner in the enlisted mess hall, sailors approached her table with technical questions about equipment they'd been struggling with. Word had spread that the kid engineer could diagnose problems that stumped conventional analysis. Seaman recruit Kevin Brooks, the 19-year-old who'd first been impressed by Emma's knowledge, sat across from her with obvious excitement. "Miss Garrett, we've been having trouble with one of the galley refrigeration units. It keeps the food cold, but it makes this weird clicking sound that nobody can figure out." Emma looked around the mess hall, noting that their conversation was drawing attention from sailors at nearby tables. The weight of expectation felt heavier than anything she'd experienced during her formal demonstrations. "Kevin, I appreciate you asking, but I think I should probably stick to the official training sessions that Captain Ross arranged," Emma said diplomatically. "I don't want to interfere with normal maintenance procedures." Her mother, Helen, who'd been quietly eating beside her, recognized the stress in Emma's voice. Since the flight deck demonstration, Helen had found herself navigating a delicate balance, watched her daughter struggle with the attention and responsibility that came with her unexpected recognition. "Emma's right," Helen said gently. "She's still a child, and this has already been a very long day for her." But Kevin persisted with the enthusiasm of youth. "It would just take a minute to listen. The refrigeration techs are stumped, and if the unit fails completely, it could affect food service for the entire ship." Emma felt torn between her desire to help and her growing understanding that her knowledge came with obligations she wasn't sure she could handle. The refrigeration problem sounded like something her father might have been able to diagnose, but she'd never worked with food service equipment. Before she could respond, Chief Petty Officer Ray Palmer approached their table with the measured stride of someone bearing official business. "Miss Garrett, Captain Ross would like to see you in her quarters when you finish dinner." Emma's stomach tightened with anxiety. Official meetings with ship commanders usually meant serious discussions about important matters. "Did I do something wrong, Chief Palmer?" "Not at all," Ray assured her with a smile. "But there have been some developments that the captain wants to discuss with you and your mother." 20 minutes later, Emma and Helen sat in Captain Ross's personal quarters, a compact but comfortable space that reflected the balance between military efficiency and personal warmth. Captain Ross poured coffee for Helen and offered Emma a soda before settling into her desk chair. "Emma, I want to begin by saying how impressed I've been with your knowledge and professionalism," Captain Ross said. "Your contributions have already led to maintenance discoveries that will improve our operational efficiency." Emma felt a flush of pride, but she also sensed that Captain Ross was building towards something more complex. "Thank you, ma'am. However," Captain Ross continued, "your success has created some unexpected challenges that we need to address." She pulled out a tablet and showed them several email messages. "I've received inquiries from other ships requesting your diagnostic assistance. The USS Abraham Lincoln has a propulsion problem that their engineers haven't been able to solve, and the USS Enterprise wants you to evaluate their aircraft launch systems." Helen felt a chill of apprehension. "Captain, those sound like much more complex situations than what Emma has dealt with here." "Exactly my concern," Captain Ross agreed. "Emma's knowledge is impressive, but she is still a 12-year-old with limited experience. I'm worried that the Navy might try to use her expertise in ways that aren't appropriate for her age or developmental needs." Emma looked between the two women, understanding for the first time that her technical abilities had implications beyond her own life. "Are you saying I can't help other ships?" "I'm saying that we need to establish clear boundaries about how and when you contribute to naval operations," Captain Ross explained. "Your father's knowledge is valuable, but you shouldn't be burdened with responsibility for problems that experienced engineers should handle." The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. Captain Ross opened it to find Commander Alan Price standing in the corridor with obvious agitation. "Captain, I apologize for the interruption, but we have a developing situation that requires immediate attention." Captain Ross invited him in, noting the tension in his bearing. "What's the problem, Commander?" "Admiral King has received orders from the Pentagon to suspend all civilian involvement in technical operations pending a formal review," Commander Price announced. "Effective immediately. Miss Garrett is restricted from participating in any maintenance or diagnostic activities." Emma felt the blood drain from her face. "Does that mean I can't finish the training documentation we started?" "It means," Commander Price said with barely concealed satisfaction, "that proper military protocols are being restored." Captain Ross's expression darkened with controlled anger. "Commander, who specifically issued these orders?" "Rear Admiral Howard's office. The directive cites security concerns and questions about the appropriateness of civilian involvement in sensitive technical operations." Helen reached over and took her daughter's hand, feeling Emma's disappointment radiating like heat. "Emma, sweetheart, this doesn't mean your contributions weren't valuable." But Emma understood the larger implications of what was happening. Her brief moment of recognition and purpose was being swept away by institutional concerns that had nothing to do with her actual capabilities or contributions. "Captain Ross," Emma said quietly, "did I cause problems for you by trying to help?" The question hit Jennifer Ross like a physical blow. Here was a child who'd contributed genuine value to naval operations, asking if she'd somehow caused trouble by sharing her knowledge. It crystallized everything that was wrong with an institutional response that prioritized protocol over innovation. "Emma, you didn't cause any problems," Captain Ross said firmly. "You identified real technical issues and shared valuable knowledge that will help keep sailors safe. That's exactly what your father would have wanted you to do." Commander Price shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the implicit criticism in Captain Ross's words. "Captain, the Pentagon's concerns about security and proper procedures are legitimate." "Are they, Commander?" Captain Ross replied, her tone carrying the authority of command. "Or are they based on discomfort with the idea that expertise doesn't always come in expected packages?" Emma watched the tension between the two officers, understanding that her situation had become a symbol of larger conflicts within the naval hierarchy. She thought about her father's teachings regarding courage and conviction, and about the responsibility that came with knowledge. "Captain Ross," Emma said carefully, "if the Pentagon thinks my involvement is inappropriate, maybe they're right. I don't want to cause problems for people who are just trying to do their jobs." The mature response from someone so young left both officers momentarily speechless. Helen felt her heart break a little as she watched her daughter accept disappointment with the same grace that her father had shown during difficult times. Captain Ross studied Emma for a long moment, then made a decision that would define her leadership legacy. "Emma, what if I told you that sometimes the most important thing a person can do is stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult? Dad always said that courage wasn't about not being scared, but about doing the right thing." "Even when you were scared," Emma replied. "Your father was a wise man," Captain Ross said, "and right now, I think the right thing is to make sure that the Pentagon understands exactly what we're dealing with here." She reached for her secure communications terminal, her expression showing the determination that had earned her command of one of the Navy's most important ships. "Commander Price, please arrange a video conference with Rear Admiral Howard's office. I believe it's time for a frank discussion about innovation, expertise, and the true meaning of naval excellence." Emma felt a surge of hope mixed with anxiety as she realized that Captain Ross was preparing to challenge the Pentagon's directive directly. The situation was escalating beyond anything she'd imagined when she first noticed the acoustic irregularities in the ship's engines. "Captain?" Helen said worriedly. "I don't want Emma's situation to affect your career or cause problems for your crew." Jennifer Ross looked at Helen with the steady gaze of someone who had made peace with difficult decisions throughout her military career. "Mrs. Garrett, your husband died serving his country and advancing naval engineering. If I can't stand up for his daughter when she's trying to continue his work, then I don't deserve to wear this uniform." The statement hung in the air like a challenge to everyone present, setting the stage for a confrontation that would test the Navy's commitment to innovation against its attachment to traditional authority structures. The secure video conference connection established itself with the crisp efficiency of military communications technology. On the main screen, Rear Admiral Kenneth Howard appeared from his Pentagon office, his uniform immaculate and his expression stern with the authority of someone accustomed to unquestioned compliance. Captain Ross sat at the head of the conference table, flanked by Emma and Helen on one side and Commander Price on the other. Admiral Thomas King had joined them, his presence adding weight to what was already shaping up as a confrontation between ship-level operations and Pentagon policy. "Captain Ross," Rear Admiral Howard began without preamble, "I understand you have, concerns about the directive to suspend civilian involvement in technical operations aboard your vessel." "Admiral Howard," Captain Ross replied with measured formality, "I have serious concerns about a policy that dismisses legitimate technical expertise based solely on the contributor's age and civilian status." Emma sat quietly beside her mother, feeling the weight of being discussed as both a person and a policy problem. The adults were speaking about her as if she weren't present, which made her feel even more like a child, despite the technical knowledge she demonstrated. "Captain, surely you understand the security implications of allowing unauthorized personnel access to sensitive naval systems," Rear Admiral Howard continued. "Miss Garrett may be well-intentioned, but she lacks the clearance levels and training certifications required for such involvement." Admiral King leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "Kenneth, with respect, Miss Garrett identified technical problems that our certified personnel had missed. Her contributions have already prevented potential equipment failures that could have affected operational readiness." "That's precisely the problem, Thomas," Rear Admiral Howard replied. "If our trained engineers are missing problems that a child can identify, we have training deficiencies that need to be addressed through proper channels, not by relying on civilian consultants." Emma felt a flash of indignation at being referred to as a civilian consultant, but she remembered her father's advice about choosing battles carefully. Still, the implication that her contributions somehow reflected poorly on naval personnel bothered her deeply. "Admiral Howard," Emma said quietly, surprising everyone by speaking up, "I never said that Navy engineers were doing anything wrong. I just noticed some things because my dad taught me to listen in a specific way." The interruption created an awkward pause as Rear Admiral Howard found himself being addressed directly by the 12-year-old at the center of the controversy. "Miss Garrett, I appreciate your perspective, but these matters are properly handled between commissioned officers." "But, sir," Emma persisted with respectful determination, "if I heard something that could help keep sailors safe, Wouldn't it be wrong not to mention it?" Helen placed a gentle hand on her daughter's arm, recognizing the courage it took for Emma to speak up, but also understanding the delicate nature of military hierarchy. Emma let the officers discuss the policy issues. Captain Ross, however, was impressed by Emma's willingness to advocate for her position. "Actually, Mrs. Garrett, I think Emma raises an important point. Admiral Howard, we're not talking about classified information or sensitive operations. We're discussing maintenance diagnostics that help ensure equipment reliability. The classification level isn't the issue," Rear Admiral Howard replied, his patience clearly wearing thin. "The issue is maintaining proper authority structures and ensuring that operational decisions are made by qualified personnel through established channels." Commander Price, who had been silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke up. "Admiral Howard is correct about maintaining proper protocols. Miss Garrett's involvement, however well-intentioned, sets a precedent that could undermine traditional command authority." Emma looked at Commander Price with curiosity rather than anger. "Commander, do you think I was wrong to point out the problems I heard?" "I think," Commander Price replied carefully, "that there are proper ways to report technical concerns, and those ways involve going through trained military personnel rather than making direct contributions to operational systems." "But what if the trained personnel don't hear what I'm hearing?" Emma asked, with genuine confusion. "Dad always said that different people notice different things and that the best teams use everyone's observations." The simple logic of Emma's question created another uncomfortable silence. Rear Admiral Howard found himself in the position of arguing against utilizing available expertise simply because it came from an unconventional source. Dr. Barbara Wright, who'd been observing quietly from the side of the room, stepped forward with the professional authority of her position as ship psychologist. "Admiral Howard, if I may offer a perspective from the standpoint of human resource utilization." "Proceed, Doctor." "Miss Garrett represents a unique intersection of technical knowledge and fresh perspective," Dr. Wright explained. "From a psychological standpoint, her contributions demonstrate the value of diverse approaches to problem solving. Dismissing her input solely based on age and civilian status might deprive the Navy of valuable diagnostic capabilities." Rear Admiral Howard's expression suggested that he was growing tired of being lectured about policy by subordinates. "Doctor, you're right. I appreciate your professional opinion, but operational security and proper procedures cannot be compromised for the sake of psychological theory." "Admiral," Emma said, her voice gaining strength as she found her footing in the adult conversation, "what if we could find a way for me to help that didn't compromise security or procedures?" All eyes turned to Emma as she continued with the careful reasoning her father had taught her. "What if I only worked on systems that aren't classified and only when regular maintenance people asked for help? That way, I wouldn't be making decisions or accessing sensitive information." "Captain." Ross felt a surge of admiration for Emma's diplomatic approach. "That's actually a reasonable compromise. Ms. Garrett could serve as a consulting resource for non-classified diagnostic challenges, working through proper military channels." "Absolutely not," Rear Admiral Howard said firmly. "The precedent alone would be unacceptable. We cannot have civilian dependents, regardless of their knowledge, participating in any aspect of naval operations." Emma felt the finality in his tone, and understood that no amount of reasoning would change his position. But she also remembered her father's teachings about persistence and creative problem-solving. "Admiral Howard," Emma said respectfully, "could I ask you a question about my dad?" The personal reference caught Rear Admiral Howard off guard. What about your father? Did you know him when he was working on propulsion efficiency projects? I was familiar with Lieutenant Commander Garrett's work. Yes. Emma reached into her pocket and pulled out a small notebook filled with her father's handwriting. This is one of Dad's project journals. He wrote down all his observations about acoustic diagnostics and system analysis. Would it be okay if I gave this to Navy engineers so they could learn his techniques? The offer created a subtle shift in the room's dynamics. Emma was proposing to share her father's knowledge through official channels rather than continuing her direct involvement in operations. Emma, that's very generous, Captain Ross said softly, understanding the personal significance of the notebook. Rear Admiral Howard studied the notebook through the binayayo. Fonecrosadiwagiaso, clearly wrestling with the implications of Emma's offer. Miss Garrett, your father's technical contributions were indeed valuable to the Navy. Then maybe his techniques could help other engineers learn to hear problems the way he did, Emma suggested. I could help translate his notes so they make sense to people who didn't learn directly from him. Helen watched her daughter navigate the complex political situation with a maturity that was both impressive and heartbreaking. Emma was essentially offering to give up her direct involvement in exchange for preserving her father's legacy. Admiral King recognized the wisdom in Emma's proposal. Kenneth, that approach would address your security and protocol concerns while preserving access to valuable diagnostic techniques. It would also, Dr. Wright added, provide Miss Garrett with a meaningful way to honor her father's memory while contributing to naval excellence. Rear Admiral Howard was quiet for nearly a minute, clearly weighing the political and operational implications of various decisions. Finally, he spoke with the measured tone of someone making an official pronouncement. Miss Garrett, I would be willing to consider a limited arrangement where you assist in documenting your father's diagnostic techniques for inclusion in naval training materials. However, any direct involvement in operational systems would remain prohibited. Emma felt a mixture of disappointment and relief. It wasn't the recognition she'd hoped for, but it preserved some connection to her father's work and allowed her to contribute something meaningful to the Navy. I understand, Admiral Howard, Emma said with quiet dignity. I just want Dad's knowledge to help keep sailors safe. Captain Ross looked at Emma with profound respect, recognizing the grace with which she'd accepted a compromise that fell short of her capabilities but honored her father's legacy. Admiral Howard, I believe Miss Garrett's offer represents exactly the kind of innovation and dedication that makes the Navy strong. Perhaps, Rear Admiral Howard replied. Commander Wells will coordinate with your staff to establish appropriate protocols for documenting Lieutenant Commander Garrett's techniques. As the video conference ended, Emma sat quietly contemplating the outcome. She'd achieved something significant, but it felt smaller than the direct contribution she'd been making over the past few days. Helen put her arm around her daughter's shoulders. Emma, I'm so proud of how you handled that. Your father would have been amazed by your maturity and diplomacy. I just wanted to keep helping, Emma said softly. But I guess sometimes helping means finding ways to work within the system instead of changing it. Admiral King studied Emma with newfound respect. Miss Garrett, what you accomplished today was more difficult than any technical diagnosis. You found a way to preserve your father's contributions while respecting institutional concerns. That's the mark of a true leader. Emma looked up at Admiral King, remembering his initial skepticism and dismissive attitude. "Admiral, do you think Dad would have been proud of how this turned out?" Thomas King thought about Lieutenant Commander James Garrett, a man he'd known as both a brilliant engineer and a devoted father. "Emma, your father, spent his career finding ways to make naval systems work better. Today, you found a way to make the naval system work better for everyone involved. I think he would have been very proud indeed." The validation from someone who'd initially doubted her meant more to Emma than any technical recognition could have provided, marking a turning point in her understanding of both her father's legacy and her own potential to carry it forward. 2 weeks later, Emma sat in the Norfolk Naval Base library, surrounded by stacks of her father's technical journals and a laptop computer provided by the Navy's Training Development Department. Lieutenant Michelle Lewis worked beside her, translating James Garrett's complex engineering notes into training modules that could be understood by naval personnel at various skill levels. "Emma, your father's observations about harmonic frequency patterns are incredibly detailed," Lieutenant Lewis said, studying a page covered with mathematical formulas and hand-drawn acoustic waveforms. "How did he develop such precise measurement techniques?" Emma looked up from the notebook she'd been transcribing, her face brightening with memories of weekend lessons in her father's workshop. "Dad built this special listening booth in our garage where he could record engine sounds without background noise. He taught me to sit in there for hours, learning to identify different frequency patterns. That explains the accuracy of your diagnostic abilities," Lieutenant Lewis mused. "You weren't just learning theory. You were developing practical skills through direct experience." The work of documenting James Garrett's techniques had proven more complex than anyone anticipated. His notes revealed years of innovative thinking about acoustic diagnostics, including methods for identifying problems that conventional monitoring systems routinely missed. Emma found herself serving not just as a translator, but as the only person who truly understood the practical application of his theoretical work. Frank Skipper Nelson, Emma's elderly neighbor and retired Navy captain, had become an unexpected ally in the documentation process. At 67, Frank possessed institutional memory about naval engineering practices that bridged the gap between older diagnostic traditions and modern technological approaches. "Emma," Frank said as he entered the library carrying a box of additional materials, "I brought some of the acoustic analysis equipment your father borrowed from the base workshop. Figured you might want to demonstrate his techniques using the actual tools he developed." Emma's eyes widened as she recognized equipment from her father's workshop that she hadn't seen since his death. "Skipper Frank, where did you find all this?" "Your mother asked me to clean out the garage storage last month," Frank explained gently. "Helen thought you might want to use your dad's equipment for this project, but she wasn't ready to go through it herself." The emotional weight of handling her father's actual research tools nearly overwhelmed Emma. But she also felt a profound connection to his work that transcended mere memory. These were the instruments he'd used to develop the techniques she was now teaching to others. Lieutenant Lewis recognized the significance of the moment and gave Emma space to process her feelings. "Take your time with this, Emma. We're not in any hurry." Emma carefully lifted an acoustic sensor from the box, noting her father's precise calibration marks and the modifications he'd made to improve its sensitivity. "Dad always said that tools were extensions of an engineer's senses. He spent years perfecting these modifications." The library door opened to admit journalist Amanda Cole, who'd been following Emma's story for a series of articles about innovation in military families. At 34, Amanda had built her reputation by finding human interest stories within larger institutional narratives. "Miss Garrett, I hope I'm not interrupting," Amanda said respectfully. "I was wondering if you'd be willing to discuss how your father's work is being incorporated into official Navy training programs." Emma looked at Lieutenant Lewis, who nodded encouragingly. The Navy had approved limited media coverage of the documentation project as a way of highlighting innovation and family contributions to military excellence. "Miss Cole, I guess it's okay to talk about it," Emma said cautiously. "What would you like to know?" Amanda settled into a nearby chair, her recording device visible but unobtrusive. "I'm interested in how a 12-year-old's knowledge is changing the way the Navy thinks about technical training." "I don't think I'm changing anything," Emma replied modestly. "I'm just helping other people learn what my dad already knew. But the techniques you're documenting weren't part of standard naval training before, were they?" Lieutenant Lewis stepped in to provide context. "Miss Garrett's father developed innovative diagnostic methods that combined traditional acoustic analysis with a modern understanding of system dynamics. The Navy is now incorporating these techniques into our engineering curricula." Amanda made notes while observing the easy collaboration between Emma and the young officer. "Emma, how does it feel to know that your father's work will be taught to future naval engineers?" Emma considered the question seriously, understanding that her answer would be read by people far beyond the naval community. "It makes me feel like Dad's still helping keep sailors safe, even though he can't be here himself." The simple statement captured something profound about legacy and service that Amanda recognized would resonate with her readers. "Are you planning to become a naval engineer yourself when you're older?" "Maybe," Emma said thoughtfully. "But Dad always said that the most important thing was to find ways to help people, whether that was through engineering or something else." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Congressman Peter Graham, whose advocacy for Veterans Affairs had brought him to Norfolk to observe the documentation project firsthand. At 49, Peter had built his political career on supporting military families and ensuring that their contributions were properly recognized. "Miss Garrett," Congressman Graham said warmly, "I've been hearing remarkable things about the work you're doing here." Emma stood politely, still adjusting to the attention from high-ranking officials. "Thank you, Congressman Graham. Lieutenant Lewis has been helping me turn Dad's notes into something other people can use. That's exactly the kind of innovation that makes our military strong," Peter replied. "Your father's service and now your contributions demonstrate the valuable knowledge that exists within military families." Amanda saw the opportunity to expand her story. "Congressman, does Emma's situation suggest that the military should be more open to contributions from family members?" Peter chose his words carefully, aware that his response would be scrutinized by military leadership. "I think Emma's experience demonstrates that expertise can emerge from unexpected sources and that institutions benefit when they remain open to innovation." Emma listened to the adults discuss her situation with a growing understanding of the broader implications. Her personal story had become part of larger conversations about institutional change and the value of diverse perspectives. Dr. Barbara Wright entered the library with the quiet authority of someone bringing important news. "Emma, I have an update from Captain Ross that I think you'll find interesting." "What kind of update, Dr. Wright?" The maintenance procedures you recommended for the port turbine bearing were completed yesterday, Dr. Wright. Russ announced. The repairs resulted in a 4% improvement in fuel efficiency and eliminated the harmonic irregularities you identified. Emma felt a surge of satisfaction that was both personal and professional. Her father's techniques had not only identified problems, but had led to measurable improvements in ship performance. Lieutenant Lewis looked up from her notes with obvious excitement. Emma, that's quantifiable validation of your diagnostic methods. The Navy loves data that proves operational improvements. More importantly, Frank Nelson added with a grandfather's pride, it proves that your father's work continues to make a real difference. Congressman Graham recognized the significance of the reported results. Miss Garrett, documented improvements like these provide concrete evidence of the value of innovative thinking within military operations. Emma understood that the successful repairs represented more than just validation of her abilities. They demonstrated that her father's legacy could contribute to ongoing naval excellence while honoring the institutional frameworks that maintained military effectiveness. Will this information be included in the training materials we're developing? Emma asked Lieutenant Lewis. Absolutely. Case studies with measurable results are the most effective teaching tools we have. Amanda Cole was rapidly taking notes, recognizing that the documented success provided a compelling conclusion to Emma's story. Emma, knowing that your father's techniques led to actual operational improvements, how do you feel about the compromise that limits your direct involvement in ship operations? Emma thought about the question while handling one of her father's acoustic sensors, feeling the weight of his modifications and the precision of his craftsmanship. I think Dad would have said that the most important thing was getting the knowledge to people who could use it effectively. Whether I'm the one using it directly doesn't matter as much as making sure it helps keep people safe. The mature perspective impressed everyone present, particularly Congressman Graham, who'd seen how power and recognition could corrupt individuals of any age. Emma's focus on service over personal achievement reflected the best values of military families. Dr. Wright observed the interaction with professional interest, noting how Emma had integrated her grief and loss into a sense of purpose that transcended personal recognition. Emma, your father would be very proud of how you've handled this entire situation. I hope so, Emma replied quietly. Sometimes I worry that I'm not smart enough to really understand everything he. Ya sol desasada dice quisieras desquexi. Más más. Frank Nelson chuckled with the wisdom of age and experience. Emma, the fact that you're worried about that proves you understand more than you think. Your father always said that the best engineers were the ones who knew how much they still had to learn. As the afternoon work session concluded, Emma looked around the library at the adults who'd become invested in preserving her father's legacy. She'd entered this experience as a grieving child, trying to honor her father's memory. But she was emerging as someone who understood the complex relationship between individual knowledge and institutional change. Lieutenant Lewis began, packing up the documentation materials, already planning the next phase of training development. Emma, we've made incredible progress. Your father's techniques are going to help naval engineers for generations to come. Emma carefully returned her father's equipment to its protective case, understanding that this phase of her involvement was nearing completion. But rather than feeling sad about the ending, she felt satisfied that she'd found a way to ensure that James Garrett's innovative thinking would continue to contribute to naval excellence long after his personal story had faded from memory. 6 months later, Emma stood in the auditorium of the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, watching as Admiral Thomas King approached the podium to address an audience of senior naval officers, engineering specialists, and military family advocates. The Garrett Acoustic Diagnostic Protocol had been officially incorporated into Navy training curricula, and today's ceremony would formally recognize the contributions of Lieutenant Commander James Garrett and his daughter. Helen sat beside Emma in the front row, wearing her best dress and the quiet pride of someone whose family's sacrifice had been transformed into lasting institutional benefit. The past months had brought remarkable changes to their lives, but none more significant than Emma's growing understanding of her place in a larger story about service, innovation, and legacy. "Ladies and gentlemen," Admiral King began, his voice carrying the authority earned through his own journey from skepticism to advocacy. "Today, we gather to recognize contributions that challenge our assumptions about expertise, age, and the sources of innovation within our naval community." Emma felt nervous butterflies in her stomach as she realized that hundreds of people were here specifically to acknowledge her father's work and her role in preserving it. The attention still felt overwhelming sometimes, but she'd learned to focus on the purpose behind the recognition rather than the recognition itself. "6 months ago," Admiral King continued, "I met a 12-year-old girl who claimed she could diagnose problems with our most sophisticated naval systems. My initial response was skepticism, based on decades of experience with traditional hierarchies and conventional wisdom about expertise." Emma remembered that first encounter vividly, particularly Admiral King's dismissive laughter and his certainty that no child could contribute meaningfully to naval operations. The transformation in his attitude had been gradual but profound, reflecting broader changes in how the Navy approached innovation and knowledge sharing. "What I learned from Emma Garrett," Admiral King said, looking directly at her, "was that expertise is not always packaged in expected forms, and that our institutions are strongest when they remain open to wisdom from unexpected sources." Captain Jennifer Ross, who'd been promoted to Rear Admiral following her principled leadership during the Constellation incident, stood to address the audience. Her promotion had been widely seen as recognition of her ability to balance innovation with institutional responsibility. "The Garrett Diagnostic Protocol," Admiral Ross announced, "has been implemented across 17 naval installations and has resulted in early identification of mechanical problems that would have cost millions of dollars and potentially compromised operational readiness." Emma felt a deep sense of satisfaction knowing that her father's techniques were preventing the kind of equipment failures that could endanger sailors' lives. The abstract concept of making a difference had become concrete through documented improvements in naval maintenance procedures. Lieutenant Michelle Lewis, now Lieutenant Commander Lewis, following her own promotion, approached the microphone with a folder containing implementation statistics. "In the past 6 months, naval engineers trained in acoustic diagnostic techniques have identified 43 potential equipment failures before they reached critical status, resulting in estimated savings of $12 million and the prevention of 3 potential mission compromises." The numbers represented more than cost savings to Emma. They represented problems her father's knowledge had helped solve, even though he couldn't be there to see the results. Each prevented failure was a validation of his innovative thinking and his dedication to improving naval operations. Dr. Barbara Wright stood to present the psychological and educational aspects of the Garrett Protocol implementation. Beyond the technical benefits, this program has demonstrated the value of intergenerational knowledge transfer and the importance of preserving expertise within military families. Emma had participated in several research studies examining how technical knowledge was transmitted within military families, helping Dr. Wright understand the unique educational dynamics that had enabled a 12-year-old to master complex engineering concepts. Most significantly, Dr. Wright continued, Emma Garrett's experience has shown us that children in military families often possess a deep understanding of their parents' professional knowledge, and that this understanding represents an untapped resource for institutional learning. The comment resonated throughout the auditorium, a powerful testament to the unexpected source of invaluable insights. Auditorium as officers reflected on their own children's exposure to military knowledge and the potential contributions that family members might make to operational excellence. Congressman Peter Graham took the podium to address the policy implications of Emma's story. The Garrett case has led to legislation establishing the Military Family Innovation Initiative, which creates formal pathways for family members to contribute technical knowledge while respecting security requirements and institutional protocols. Emma understood that her personal story had become part of broader efforts to recognize and utilize the expertise that existed within military communities. The legislation would create opportunities for other military children and spouses to share specialized knowledge without compromising operational security. This initiative, Congressman Graham explained, acknowledges that military families develop unique expertise through their close proximity to specialized operations, and that this expertise can contribute to national defense when properly channeled through appropriate institutions. The formal presentations concluded with the unveiling of a memorial plaque honoring Lieutenant Commander James Garrett's contributions to naval engineering. Emma felt tears in her eyes as she read her father's name, permanently inscribed alongside recognition of his innovative diagnostic techniques. But the most meaningful moment came when Admiral King invited Emma to join him at the podium for closing remarks. Standing beside the man who'd initially dismissed her abilities, Emma felt the full weight of how much had changed for both of them. "Miss Garrett," Admiral King said, "would you like to share any thoughts about what this recognition means to you and your family?" Emma looked out at the audience of naval officers, engineers, and family advocates, understanding that her words would be recorded as part of the official ceremony. She thought about her father's teachings regarding courage, service, and the responsibility that came with knowledge. "Admiral King, when this all started, I just wanted people to listen when I heard something that might be important," Emma said, her voice steady despite her nervousness. "I didn't understand that trying to help would lead to all of this." She paused, gathering her thoughts as she considered the broader implications of her experience. "Dad always taught me that the most important thing about knowledge was sharing it with people who could use it to help others. I think that's what happened here." Emma gestured toward the memorial plaque bearing her father's name. "This isn't really about me being smart or special. It's about Dad's work continuing to help keep sailors safe, and about the Navy being willing to listen when someone has something useful to contribute." The simplicity and wisdom of her perspective created a profound silence in the auditorium. Here was a child who'd navigated complex institutional politics and emerged with a clear understanding of service that transcended personal recognition. "But mostly," Emma continued, I think Dad would want people to remember that good ideas can come from anywhere, and that the best way to honor someone's memory is to make sure their knowledge keeps helping people long after they're gone. Admiral King found himself deeply moved by Emma's mature perspective on legacy and service. Miss Garrett, your father would indeed be proud of how you've carried forward his work and his values. As the ceremony concluded, Emma was approached by young naval officers who wanted to understand more about acoustic diagnostic techniques and by military children who'd been inspired by her story. She realized that her role had evolved from translator of her father's knowledge to advocate for innovation and inclusion within military communities. Helen watched her daughter interact with admirals and enlisted personnel with equal respect and genuine interest, recognizing that Emma had developed leadership qualities that transcended her technical knowledge. The grief and loss that had initially motivated Emma's involvement had been transformed into a sense of purpose that would guide her for years to come. Frank Skipper Nelson, now recognized as an unofficial mentor in the documentation process, approached Emma with the satisfied expression of someone who'd witnessed remarkable growth. "Emma, your father would be amazed by what you've accomplished, but I think he'd be most proud of the person you've become through this experience." Emma looked around the reception, watching as naval personnel discussed the implementation of her father's techniques and planned future innovations based on his foundational work. The acoustic diagnostic equipment he modified was now standard in naval training facilities, and his theoretical frameworks were being studied by engineering students throughout the military education system. "Skipper Frank, do you think Dad knew that his work would end up helping so many people?" Frank considered the question while observing the continuing conversations about technical innovation and institutional change. "Emma, I think your father knew that good engineering work has a way of growing beyond its original purpose, but I don't think he could have imagined that his greatest contribution would be raising a daughter who could teach the Navy about courage, persistence, and the true meaning of service." As Emma and Helen prepared to leave the ceremony, Admiral King approached them with the respectful manner of someone who'd learned important lessons about leadership and humility. "Mrs. Garrett, Miss Garrett, thank you for your patience with an old admiral who had to learn that wisdom doesn't always come in expected packages," Admiral King said sincerely. "Emma, you've taught me that true leadership means recognizing and nurturing excellence wherever it appears." Emma looked up at the man who'd initially dismissed her as just another military child playing with concepts beyond her understanding. "Admiral King, I think you taught me something important too." "What's that?" "That even when people don't believe you at first, if you keep doing what's right and stay respectful, sometimes they'll listen, and maybe even become friends." Admiral King smiled with genuine warmth, understanding that Emma's observation captured something essential about leadership, change, and the importance of maintaining dignity even when facing skepticism. As they walked toward the parking lot, Emma reflected on the journey that had begun with her simple observation about acoustic irregularities in a ship's engine. That moment of speaking up, despite uncertainty, had led to institutional changes, policy innovations, and recognition that would preserve her father's legacy for generations of naval personnel. "Mom, do you think this is really the end, or just the beginning?" Emma asked as they reached their car. Helen looked back at the Naval War College, where officers were still discussing the implications of the Garrett Protocol and planning future implementations of innovative diagnostic techniques. Emma, I think this is just the beginning. Your father's work will continue helping people for years to come. And you've shown that his greatest achievement was raising a daughter who understands the true meaning of service. Emma settled into the passenger seat, her father's Naval Academy ring still hanging from its chain around her neck, understanding that she'd found a way to honor his memory while building her own path forward. The technical knowledge he'd shared would continue protecting sailors. But more importantly, his lessons about courage, integrity, and service would guide her own contributions to a world that needed both innovation and wisdom. As they drove away from Newport, Emma already found herself thinking about the acoustic engineering program she wanted to study in college, the naval career she might pursue, and the ways she could continue improving the systems that kept people safe. Her father's legacy had become her foundation, but her future would be her own creation, built on the understanding that the greatest service came from using whatever talents you possessed to help others achieve their missions. The story that had begun with a 12-year-old girl noticing something wrong with a ship's engine had evolved into a testament to the power of listening, the importance of speaking up, and the enduring value of knowledge shared across generations. Emma Garrett had learned that true expertise wasn't about being the smartest person in the room, but about finding ways to make everyone in the room a little bit better at protecting the people who mattered most. 3 years had passed since the Naval War College ceremony, and 15-year-old Emma Garrett stood on the deck of the USS Constellation during her summer internship with the Naval Historical Center's Youth Engineering Program. Her auburn hair, now reaching her shoulders, framed a face that held the quiet confidence of someone who had found her purpose. Shoulders caught the Boston Harbor breeze as she worked alongside professional conservators to preserve the acoustic heritage of America's oldest commissioned naval vessel. The intervening years had brought remarkable changes to both Emma and the broader naval community. The Garrett Protocol had expanded beyond simple diagnostic techniques to encompass a comprehensive approach to preventative maintenance that emphasized human intuition alongside technological precision. Emma herself had evolved from a grieving child sharing her father's knowledge into a confident teenager pursuing her own path in naval engineering. Master Chief Robert M. Mallister, now serving as Emma's mentor coordinator, approached with the measured gait of someone whose respect had been earned through demonstrated competence rather than age or rank. At 58, Mac had overseen the implementation of the Garrett Protocol across the Atlantic Fleet and had become one of Emma's strongest advocates within the naval establishment. Emma, we've got some visitors from the Pentagon who'd like to meet with you about the Advanced Diagnostic Initiative, Mac said, his weathered face showing the satisfaction of someone who'd watched exceptional talent develop over time. Emma looked up from the acoustic sensor she'd been calibrating, noting the serious expression that suggested this wasn't a routine consultation. What kind of initiative, Master Chief? The Navy's developing a new program that combines traditional diagnostic techniques with artificial intelligence systems, Mac explained. They want your input on how to preserve the human elements that make acoustic analysis effective. The request represented a significant evolution in how the military viewed Emma's contributions. No longer was she simply translating her father's work. She was being consulted as an expert in her own right, someone whose insights could shape the future of naval maintenance practices. Dr. Patricia Winters, now Director of Naval Family Innovation Programs, emerged from the ship's lower decks, carrying a tablet filled with implementation data from installations worldwide. Her program had grown from Emma's individual case into a comprehensive effort to identify and utilize expertise within military communities. Emma, the visitors include some people you haven't met, but also some familiar faces, Dr. Winters said with a knowing smile. Admiral Ross is leading the delegation, and she's brought some interesting proposals for your consideration. The mention of Admiral Ross brought a warmth to Emma's expression that reflected years of mentorship and genuine friendship. Jennifer Ross had become more than a professional contact. She'd evolved into a family friend who understood both Emma's capabilities and her need to develop as a normal teenager alongside her technical pursuits. "Is this about the college preparation program we discussed?" Emma asked, her voice carrying the confidence of someone accustomed to participating in high-level discussions about her future. "Among other things," Dr. Winters replied diplomatically. "But I think it's better if Admiral Ross explains the full scope of what they're considering." 20 minutes later, Emma sat in the ship's historic captain's cabin, surrounded by naval officers whose careers had been shaped by the innovations she'd helped introduce. Admiral Ross, now wearing the 3 stars of a vice admiral, commanded the meeting with the authority of someone who'd learned to balance institutional tradition with innovative thinking. "Emma, thank you for taking time from your internship to meet with us," Admiral Ross began. "What we're discussing today represents the next evolution of the work you began 3 years ago." Beside Admiral Ross sat Captain Michael Stevens, a former Annapolis classmate of Emma's father, who now directed the Navy's Advanced Technology Integration Office. At 47, Michael had spent his career bridging the gap between cutting-edge research and practical naval applications. "Miss Garrett," Captain Stevens said, "your father's diagnostic techniques have been so successful that we're exploring ways to integrate them with emerging artificial intelligence systems. The goal is to create hybrid diagnostic platforms that combine human intuition with machine precision." Emma leaned forward with genuine interest, understanding that this represented exactly the kind of technological advancement her father would have embraced. "Captain Stevens, how would human operators interface with AI systems in practical diagnostic situations?" "That's precisely what we need your expertise to determine," Admiral Ross replied. "We can program computers to recognize acoustic patterns, but we're struggling to replicate the intuitive leaps that human analysts make when identifying unusual problems." The challenge excited Emma, because it represented a synthesis of everything she'd learned about both human perception and technological capability. Over the past 3 years, her understanding had expanded far beyond her father's original techniques to encompass broader questions about how humans and machines could work together effectively. Commander Lisa Chen, daughter of Captain Jennifer Ross and now a promising naval engineer in her own right, presented technical specifications for the proposed hybrid systems. "Emma, we've been studying your diagnostic methods and trying to understand what makes human acoustic analysis so effective in situations where traditional sensors fail." Emma studied the technical drawings, noting the sophisticated sensor arrays and processing capabilities that the new systems would incorporate. "Commander Chen, I think the key difference is that humans can recognize patterns that don't fit standard categories. Dad always said that the most dangerous problems were the ones that developed in unexpected ways. Exactly, Captain Stevens agreed. Our AI systems excel at identifying known failure patterns, but they struggle with novel problems that don't match their training data. We need human operators who can guide the systems toward investigating unusual observations. The discussion continued for over an hour as Emma provided insights into the cognitive processes that made acoustic diagnostics effective. Her explanations revealed a sophisticated understanding of both human perception and machine learning that impressed even the most experienced engineers present. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a civilian researcher from the Naval Research Laboratory, had been taking detailed notes throughout the meeting. Miss Garrett, your analysis suggests that effective human-AI collaboration requires systems that can respond to operator intuition rather than simply providing automated conclusions. That sounds right, Emma replied thoughtfully. The best diagnostic work happens when humans and machines each do what they're good at. Machines can measure things precisely and remember vast amounts of data. But humans can notice when something feels wrong, even if they can't immediately explain why. Admiral Ross recognized that Emma's perspective represented exactly the kind of innovative thinking the Navy needed to maintain technological superiority. Emma, we'd like you to consider participating in the development of these hybrid systems through an accelerated education program that would combine high school completion with advanced technical training. The proposal represented an opportunity that would fundamentally alter Emma's educational trajectory while honoring her commitment to naval service. Admiral Ross, what would that program involve? A partnership with the Naval Academy to design a curriculum that prepares you for both civilian engineering excellence and naval leadership, Admiral Ross explained. You'd graduate with both a high school diploma and significant progress toward advanced degrees in acoustical engineering and artificial intelligence. Emma felt the weight of the decision, understanding that accepting would commit her to a path that honored her father's legacy while building her own professional identity. Could I discuss this with my mother before making a decision? Of course, Admiral Ross assured her. This is precisely the kind of choice that should involve family consultation. Helen Garrett, now working as a coordinator for military family support services, had been waiting in the Harbor Visitor Center during Emma's meeting. The past 3 years had brought significant positive changes to her life as well, including meaningful work that helped other military families navigate challenges similar to those she'd faced. "How did the meeting go, sweetheart?" Helen asked as Emma joined her on the pier overlooking Boston Harbor. Emma described the proposed program while studying her mother's expression for signs of concern or enthusiasm. "Mom, it would mean making a pretty big commitment to naval service, but it would also give me incredible opportunities to continue Dad's work." Helen had anticipated this moment for years, understanding that Emma's talents and interests would eventually lead to significant career decisions. "Emma, what does your heart tell you about this opportunity?" "That it feels like exactly what Dad would want me to do," Emma replied without hesitation. "Not because he'd want me to follow his path exactly, but because it would let me use everything he taught me to help solve problems that really matter." Helen smiled with the wisdom of someone who'd learned to trust her daughter's judgment through years of watching Emma navigate complex situations with remarkable maturity. Then I think you should seriously consider it. Your father always said that the best decisions were the ones that felt both challenging and right. As they walked along the harbor, Emma found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. 3 years earlier, she'd been a grieving child, trying to honor her father's memory by sharing his technical knowledge. Now, she was being invited to help shape the future of naval engineering through innovative collaboration between human expertise and artificial intelligence. Mom, if I do this program, it means I'll be making a commitment to serve in the Navy after graduation, Emma said seriously. Are you comfortable with that idea? Helen stopped walking and turned to face her daughter, seeing both the 15-year-old who still needed guidance and the emerging adult who was capable of making life-altering decisions. Emma, your father served because he believed in protecting people and advancing knowledge that could keep others safe. If you choose naval service for the same reasons, then I'll be proud to support that decision. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Master Chief Mallister, who'd been coordinating with the Pentagon delegation about logistics and timelines. Emma, Admiral Ross asked me to let you know that there's no pressure to decide immediately. The program wouldn't begin until next summer, so you have plenty of time to consider all the implications. Emma appreciated the consideration, but she also recognized that her instinctive response to the opportunity was positive. Master Chief, do you think I'm ready for this kind of advanced program? Max studied Emma with the experienced eye of someone who'd mentored hundreds of young sailors and officers. Emma, 3 years ago, you taught a ship full of experienced engineers new ways to think about their jobs. Since then, you've continued learning and growing while helping implement programs that have improved naval operations worldwide. I think you're ready for whatever challenges you choose to take on. The validation from someone whose opinion she deeply respected helped crystallize Emma's thinking about the proposed program. As they walked back toward the Constitution, Emma found herself imagining the possibilities that lay ahead. Advanced study with leading researchers, collaboration with naval engineers on cutting-edge projects, and the opportunity to contribute to innovations that would protect sailors for generations to come. Master Chief, when Admiral Ross says this is the next evolution of Dad's work, what exactly does she mean? Emma asked. I think she means that your father's techniques were just the beginning, Mac replied thoughtfully. What you've helped create over the past 3 years is a new approach to naval engineering that values both technological sophistication and human insight. The next step is figuring out how to combine the best of both approaches. Emma nodded, understanding that the proposed program represented not an ending, but a transition to the next phase of her contribution to naval excellence. Her father's legacy had provided the foundation, but her future would be built on her own innovations and leadership. As the sun set over Boston Harbor, Emma made her decision with the confidence of someone who'd learned to trust both her abilities and her values. The accelerated program would be challenging, but it would also allow her to continue the work that had brought meaning to her life while honoring the memory of the father who taught her that knowledge was only valuable when it served others. Mom, Emma said as they prepared to leave the historic ship, I want to accept Admiral Ross's proposal. I think Dad would be proud that his work led to opportunities like this, and I want to see how far we can take it. Helen smiled, with the deep satisfaction of a mother who'd watched her daughter transform personal loss into purposeful contribution. Then we'll make it work, sweetheart. Your father's greatest dream was that his knowledge would continue helping people long after he was gone. Through you, that dream has come true in ways he never could have imagined. As they walked toward their car, Emma felt the weight of her father's Naval Academy ring against her chest, understanding that she was ready to begin earning her own symbols of service and achievement. The journey that had begun with a 12-year-old girl noticing problems that adults had missed was continuing with a 15-year-old choosing to dedicate her talents to protecting the people who served their country with honor and courage.